Like a lot of people, I'm going to do an extension wing for my table saw. It'll serve a couple of purposes. I used to have as the side extension my workbench, but that's now found a better home over there because the lathe I used to have that didn't work for years has gone. And now for a side support for the table saw, I can use a proper wing. And of course, like most people, I'm going to use it for two purposes. There's going to be a router in there with a router lift. My old router table really wasn't up to much. The original plywood top wasn't that straight, and that insert plate there really is no good at all. It's bowed, the rings don't go in properly, they're almost impossible to get out again. There is really nothing good about it. I'm not going to bother with an insert this time. What I'm going to have is just a plain old hole in here. If it needs to get bigger, I'll make it bigger and then I'll make an insert, but for the moment I can't recall ever needing any sort of hole in the router table bigger than about 1.5 inches, so that's what I'm going to start with. I've got a piece of laminate worktop. Now this table saw came originally with a rear extension, which I didn't really find a great deal of use. I prefer to just overrun onto a trestle over there. If I get a lot of long work, I'm going to make some roller supports for the back. So I've taken the angle bracket supports for that rear extension. I've put a couple of extra holes in these side legs here, and that's what my laminate is mounted on. The world doesn't need another video on making a router lift. I'm just going to detail any unique features of this one. And I've looked at 3 plans, and the one I like is from John Hyes. So I've downloaded his excellent set of plans, for which there's a link below. I want to carry on using my fence. It's got a split lower section, it's got a T-track, it's got dust extraction. It used to clamp underneath the old router table with some toggle clamps, but with this new arrangement I want to have it fit on the rip fence. So I'll find a way using this T-slot here and some brackets of connecting that. That'll be better than the toggle clamps. And the other thing I've done is change the rip fence support rails of the table saw. They used to stop about there, but I've got myself a bigger pair, and now they carry on right the way, or nearly, down to the end of the new extension rail. So I can bring the fence miles in there. It also gives me another advantage. I've mentioned in other videos, this is a peculiar table saw. The blade tilts that way, so if you want to do a bevel cut, you have to bring the fence this way. And as it used to be, that was a pretty short cut that you could make. Now that I can bring the fence all the way over here, I can make a much bigger bevel cut if I want. And here it is. I've made the carriage block here semi-cylindrical. The original plan called for a pair of V-blocks and bolts, but I took the circle cutting jig, cut out a few circles, chopped these up to make this kind of shape, glued a few together, and then put some hose clips or Jubilee clips through to hold the router body. So this is the vertically moving slider, and it has a shaft and a bearing. Another little change I've made is the way that the clamping works. When you've moved your vertical router mount to the position you like, you're going to want to secure it there and not just rely on this threading here. The original design calls for a bolt head here and another threaded rod going through this hole and impinging on that bolt head. And that bolt head is inside this part of the channel, and it's free to move at the top, it's only secured at the bottom. So as you push on that bolt head here, this impinges on the vertically moving slide and locks it in place. Except it's really just going to be pinching on one corner, essentially. So I've done something else. The most straightforward way to arrange that the router block goes up and down is to use a threaded rod in this orientation. have some kind of follower on the mount block and put a spanner in or wrench through the top and wind it up and down. There's a couple of disadvantages with that. The first disadvantage is that there's a second hole in the worktop in addition to the cutter hole. You've got the one to get your spanner through. And of course, secondly, you've got to find that spanner, which will be hiding somewhere. Matthias Wandel used right-angled gears, a threaded rod being turned by a gear that way, and then a handle turning a gear that way, transmitting that into that. But I don't have a bandsaw, my jigsaw is rubbish, and I rather fear my wood gear making skills are rubbish. This ingenious design, however, works with an inclined slot here. As this block, which is attached to this horizontal slider here, moves this across, it bears on this bearing here and raises the vertical slide on the other side. The disadvantage with this approach is friction. It's inevitable you've got the friction of the vertical slider over here, but this adds three frictional surfaces. You have this track here, bearing on the edges of this horizontally moving plate, and you've also got the face-to-face friction of this plate moving against the centerboard. Well, I don't think the face-to-face friction is too bad, and the way that the forces are organised, the friction in here isn't too bad. The forces tend, I think, to make this the worst friction. Now, John suggests, rather than paste wax, which he reckons would be a bit sticky, Vaseline or petroleum jelly, recommended incidentally by Porsche for their motor cars. But I rather fear that paste wax or petroleum jelly are going to pick up the dust in the environment that this is going to be working in. So I'm going to do something slightly different. In this channel here, I'm going to put a piece of PTFE, polytetrafluoroethylene, or Teflon to use the brand name, and have this horizontally moving board move on that piece of Teflon. I had from an old project a piece of Teflon sheet, and I've cut a strip off that to go here. If you don't have PTFE, you could also probably use another plastic that's becoming quite popular in these kinds of projects, which is ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. But I don't have any of that, and I do have some of this. If I do still need any lubrication, maybe on this face here, I think I'll use talc or talcum powder. And finally, back to clamping. How are we going to secure the vertically moving board when we're happy with its position? Well, it seems to me that the easiest thing is to just make this shaft slightly longer and clamp the horizontally moving board and the vertically moving board to the center board. Well, there's a couple more pieces to do in addition to actually screwing that channel on. I've got to make some cheek pieces here which will allow it to be affixed to the table. I've attached everything that needs to be attached, I think. The lower track is now fixed on. These two carriers for this rod are fixed on. The push block is attached to the horizontally moving plate. I didn't want holes in the back of the plate and countersinks, so I've counterbored this block here and screwed it from this side and glued, of course. Well, not of course. A lot of this is not glued because it needs to be taken apart again. So what can be glued is glued and what can't be glued isn't. I've also put the Teflon strip in, and I've put a little cover here so that the strip can't slide out. I neglected to take into account the crush nuts here, and this gap is slightly smaller than I imagined it was going to be, partly because I put this push block here a little that way to have maximum clearance for that handle there, maximum amount of time as this is travelling backwards and forwards. So I've kind of run out of room to put these securing screws here that one would normally use to hold the threaded insert into that block. So instead I've actually taken a 10mm tap and I've threaded the rest of the bore in the block here to keep that in place as the rod goes in and out. Mostly it'll be pushing that way, but there is a little bit of pull as you're withdrawing it and dropping that down again. The final thing to do is to arrange some dust collection, so I need to put a box over here. I was looking around for some plywood and I thought, oh, that might be enough, and I thought, well, actually no, it's a box. It's a wine crate, so I've chopped the end off, so that'll go that way up. The table will enclose the top part of it, and I'll use the lid here just to make an extra overhanging part here, and I'll just need to close in this gap here. Well, I can't put it off any longer. The next thing to do is bore a hole through my nice worktop here. Well, I've grasped the nettle and bored the hole. I used the circle cutting jig from the underside to bore about 2/3 of the way down, and then I used a bearing guided cutter from the other side to make a nice clean cut in the good side. One of the problems with not using an insert plate and trying to keep that as small as possible is trying to get the adjustment spanner in there to get onto your collet. Now if you've got a 2-nut collet, then that is going to be difficult. Luckily though, this one has a collet pin. So I've made a space here, and I'm going to put a cranked bolt that I've reversed down into there, and then I'm going to put a straight bolt here, and then the straight bolt can push the crank bolt forward and lock. Then I can access the one collet nut from the good side, and that seems to be just big enough to get my spanner in. I may have to grind a little bit off the edges of the spanner. Rather than grind off the corners of my 24mm spanner, I've taken this useless for the last 40 years 7/8 spanner and I've opened it out slightly to 24mm, and that fits in there nicely. And if I'm a bit careful, I won't be wearing down this lip too quickly. Nice and easy to snug up. As I said, trying to get 2 spanners down in there would not be feasible, but with the collet locking pin, then that's pretty easy. Of course, you must remember that the collet locking pin has to come out again, A, before you spin the router, or B, before you try and drop the lift. So I've got to get into the habit of giving that a quick test before moving on. So, take up the backlash by going down and then back up again. And what I'm hoping is that even with this very small roundover bit here, I'll be able to pass the workpiece over it without the workpiece rocking up and down at all as it would have done on the old insert plate, and I'll be able to get a nice clean cut. So that should be it.